Our economic systems are blind to the values of nature. We could assume that nature was infinite, and that's what was assumed for the most part. But now everybody's waking up to reality, and over these 20 years, we've worked in about 75 countries now directly, with many Stanford students and postdocs and scholars of different types really leading the way. A lot of younger people, unencumbered by tradition, just going in and figuring out how to make change.
Welcome to the Stanford Ecopreneurship Podcast, where we explore how university research and innovation move beyond the lab to shape real-world climate solutions. I'm your host, Sam McClure. This is our Academic Innovator series, and today we're speaking with world-renowned ecologist Gretchen Daily. Her work has redefined how we understand and value nature's role in human well-being. At Stanford, Gretchen is the Bing Professor of Environmental Science in the Department of Biology, the Director of the Center for Conservation Biology, and the Faculty Director of the Stanford Natural Capital Project, also known as Nat Cap. We discussed bringing ecology into economic thinking and policymaking, what makes natural capital different from financial, social, and human capital, and how a metric called GEP can help us measure the value of nature for economic activity. Well, I'd actually love to go all the way back to the beginning. I understand that you had a childhood that was split between both California and Germany. Is that right? And so I'm curious about that, and I'm curious how this concept of nature or the ecosystem was present with you, even maybe from your earliest days.
Yeah, I was lucky in California. My dad at one point was given as an unexpected gift a half dog, half wolf. That lovely being named Mishka was my main companion from ages sort of 6 to 13. And we ran around the hills in California together. And I'd say here, we've really got still a sense of wild nature, even on the campus with coyotes running around. And
Sure.
You get to see predation in action and all the other beautiful aspects of nature. Yeah, I'd say in Europe, it's a lot of the wildness disappeared many centuries back, but there's a real maybe aesthetic and integration of in design and buildings, cities, even in kind of the cultural, agricultural landscapes, and in the kind of the rhythm of a week and year. There's a lot of nature built into what people do and think about and teach their kids.
Did this sensibility that you had in California and in Europe, does that spark your interest in biology as a field of research, or what was that moment for you?
The moment was actually from running around with the dog, Mishka.
Sure.
Yeah, loving being outside. Whatever generated that, the opportunity for sure. And then maybe back in those days, kids were way less managed I wasn't managed the way I've kind of managed my own kids, more in line with the culture here to, keep them safe and have them in a bunch of camps and stuff like that. It was much more, go out, get away from the TV, get outside and
see you at dinner. That's
yeah.
right, the latchkey youth, yeah.
Yeah, that was nice.
So you end up at Stanford and you are studying biology, right? And Paul Ehrlich is your advisor, and he's doing a lot of this early work on thinking about big picture population and ecology. And so was there a reason that you felt particularly well matched with Paul, or how did that connection happen?
Oh, that was actually unexpected in a couple ways. One is I thought he was the Paul Ehrlich that is so famous in Germany for winning the Nobel Prize back in the late 1800s for inventing a form of chemotherapy. And so it was huge disappointment to see it wasn't the same guy.
Sure.
Yeah, I actually applied for a job that I saw advertised in the Daily back in those days, and it required 2 people, and I had a German friend visiting who didn't speak English, which was a pretty common thing back then, and we took the job together. And then I found out that Paul Ehrlich was actually doing really cool stuff. And so yeah, typical for myself, overly clueless undergrad. But yeah, one thing led to another. And so it was pretty fortuitous, actually. And a lot of luck opened up that way for me. And I hope for tons of other students here. I think Stanford just offers so many unexpected opportunities, and just following a path with reaching for the luck when it opens up has been a really good path for many here, and I'm really grateful to Stanford for that.
There is a lot of random luck that seems to happen, serendipity that seems to happen around here. And so Paul was a bit of, can I use the word iconoclastic?
Yeah, definitely.
There was a period of time where America was growing and economic development was seen as this universal good, and population growth was seen as this universal good. And so he was challenging some of these ideas. And so you're now in his sphere and influenced by these ideas. And so what did you end up writing your thesis on? What was your focus?
The challenges of our consumer culture, just absolutely overwhelming, what the biosphere that we're embedded in but don't think about very much, what this living planet, the only one known in the whole universe, needs to do to sustain us. Working with Paul was always an argument, but a fun argument most of the time. And I'm very grateful to him and all the others in the group over the years as well. And
so the phrase, I'm so curious, the phrase natural capital, did that come up in a paper that one of these people wrote, or a paper that you wrote, or one of these conversations more casually? I mean, do you actually remember when that term came about?
Yeah, well, we have actually looked it up. It's an old term. It goes back a long time in French literature, which surprised us. We didn't know where it came from, actually, so that's why we looked it up. But yeah, early on, economists have defined different realms of capital to worry about, and financial capital seems to be the one we hear most about, but there's also, here at the university, kind of human capital, our knowledge, skills, and our health is often lumped in with that. And then there's kind of built capital. We see that in being invested in, and we hear it every day with a massive amount of construction on campus, keeping everything humming at the highest levels. Sometimes people talk about social capital, more and more trust at the level of societies, legal, frameworks and norms, policies, and the ability to enforce those. And then natural capital has, for the most part, been a newcomer on the stage. Nobody ever worried about, the planet not being able to handle human activity. And it's really only in recent decades that we've started vastly outstripping what this planet can sustain. And maybe it was with, those shots from the moon looking back on our fragile sphere, or hearing from astronauts more recently up on the International Space Station and things, saying how overwhelmed they are by the view that you take in from up there of how small and how fragile, and in a way how small some of our fights seem to be, and worries and things, when in the face of just the staggering improbability that we actually live here, and that we're on such a beautiful looking sphere when the rest of space looks so vast and mostly dark.
Yeah, no, it's a good reminder of our finitude, right? I mean, we spend a lot of time here on this campus too, as you mentioned, thinking about our own power, the power of technology or the power of our economic system, but we are very, very tiny in the grand scheme.
Yeah, and mostly because natural capital is so new as an idea, our economic systems are blind to the values of nature. We could assume that nature was infinite, and that's what was assumed for the most part in the evolution of economic thinking and political systems and such. But now everybody's waking up to reality, and what we're trying to do through the Natural Capital Project is bring really practical and demonstrated solutions that can be adopted at scale and that lead to win-win outcomes for people and for the planet.
I want to we'll talk a lot about the work that the Nat Cap is doing, but I want to zoom in on this first moment when you're starting the organization. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about was that I imagine that from a philosophical perspective, there were biologists or conservationists or other folks who didn't like this idea of natural capital, and they had spent their lives fighting for preservation or conservation of nature on the basis of morality or for aesthetic reasons or for spiritual reasons, right? And so I imagine there was maybe a little bit of resistance, and you're probably thinking, well, yes, I agree with all of that, but all of that is not powerful enough to do what we need to do. And so this is a way to do the work that we need to do at the scale we need to do it. But I would just love to hear a little bit more about that tension from the early days.
Yeah, you said it really well. And in fact, I think within the environmental or conservation movements, you've seen tensions throughout the ages, but they've really intensified recently. And at the time, many people fought back, against this kind of perception that we were caving in to an easy way out that would sacrifice a lot of life. It was really hard to see winning overall if we didn't come in with a very compassionate and kind of more deeply embracing of the reality that people live. And most people are not out to kill and destroy nature. I don't even think I've met anybody
right.
Out to do something like that.
For its own sake.
Right. It's much more about how to, allow people ways to live that actually drive really beautiful and sustainable practices on the land or in the water. Most of the destructive practices we see now, they're not in play because of evil intention. It's just the scaling up, the incredible acceleration of human impacts. The speed and the magnitude is just kind of beyond anything people are able to grapple with. And no individual can address kind of the problems on their own. So sometimes it's just a lot easier to go through life without thinking about every problem, including this huge one. So there's been a lot of very charged disagreement within, say, the conservation or the environmental movements. But in recent decades, with people really demonstrating how, first of all, bringing nature into economic decision-making can lead to much better outcomes of the sort that everybody is pushing for. And then secondly, pursuing an economic valuation of nature doesn't in any way denigrate the deeper cultural and spiritual and other values that we hold for nature. It's a very lower bound way of saying, okay, well, we maybe hold different spiritual traditions and different upbringings and experiences with nature, but we can all agree that we don't want to be flooded, or we don't want farmers to be suffering from lack of pollinators or lack of pest control services that mostly come from nature. Or we don't want people on coastlines, facing the full brunt of hurricanes because coral reefs and mangroves and other beautiful elements of nature have been wiped out. We can live with both a very practical view of nature as to where and how much we really need to sustain and revitalize in order to have a bright future. And at the same time, we can honor the many cultures that do much more deeply embrace ideas that we hardly or basically never hear about on the news, that people are actually very much a part of nature. we're actually more non-human cells than we are human cells, and we are very controlled in subtle and often subconscious ways by our natural integration with the rest of life. There's a beauty in harmonizing kind of the approaches to conservation or to economic revitalization. And I think we can do it with this natural capital approach. We never use that term, by the way. Yeah, it doesn't roll off the tongue.
Sure.
Yeah, we made it up in the beginning just to help economists recognize what we were talking about, wanting to focus on them. But yeah, when we talk to normal people, we try to talk in a normal way, and we use terms in different languages that resonate.
A couple of small things just came to mind. One is that if I skip a meal, I very quickly am humbled by how much my gut microbiome takes over my brain, you know, to perform certain activities, right? Like I am not in control of my day. It's actually the trillions of little guys inside. And the other thing that came to mind was this idea. You were talking at the scale of systems or communities, and I was even thinking in terms of a single like redwood tree, for example, and to think that one single giant redwood tree is worth 1 million board feet of redwood lumber, and that's the only way to think about it and the only way to value it, right? That would be very surprising. And so what you're bringing in all sorts of other dimensions to this and ways to think about it. You know, you could have just had an academic career. I say just, right? You could have sort of written papers and books and gone to conferences and had that be the end of it. But we've circled around this. You started the Natural Capital Project with some other folks, and you've been doing this policy-driven work for a long time now. So why did you decide to start Nat Cap? And maybe if you have a sort of crisp mission statement, what is it that Nat Cap is trying to do?
It was all through inspiration from others, and much of my inspiration came from working in Costa Rica. That country had the highest deforestation rate ever recorded in history at a country scale. It was basically a poster child for planetary destruction. And going there and seeing some amazing people, including a guy named Alvaro Umana, who got his undergrad degree in Costa Rica, where he's from, but then he got a master's here at Stanford in economics and a PhD in civil engineering, mainly in hydrology, focused on the role of forest in controlling all kinds of things about water, the quality for drinking or irrigation, the timing of flow, avoiding floods, avoiding dry season scarcity, and for hydropower. He was just amazing. Went back to Costa Rica, became the first minister for energy and the environment. Yeah, seeing what that country did, this tiny place with not that much control over its economic path, being such a small country in such a big world of much bigger players, they completely turned around the deforestation through a program that he helped design that paid people, that just recognized, most people are living day to day. It's really hard to make money in agriculture. The most important job in the world really is growing food, and yet farmers have a really big struggle in most countries. So paying farmers to restore or to just protect remaining forest on their land helped the country go from, they were down to in the 20s, something like 25% forest cover, up to now well over 50% today, almost 60%. That was just in a few decades. So I think just seeing these inspiring places, Costa Rica really standing out, opening kind of the idea that we could all try to learn from and replicate these models of success. And I just became obsessed with trying to do that and could see that there was a huge science piece to it and also just a huge get out in the real world and work with people who know how to get stuff done and bring the science into decision making. So Nat Cap's aim is to drive the values of nature, to shine a light on the values of nature and bring them into decision making, into policy, finance, and practice all across landscapes and seascapes around the world.
Wow. And that was 20 years ago. This project has been successful and going for a long time. So what's the scale of the work that you're doing now?
Yeah, we started out with very modest projects with anybody who'd agree to work with us. And we were very lucky. We worked with World Wildlife Fund and the Nature Conservancy, our two initial partners, together with Stanford. John Hennessy signed an MOU between the three institutions. And the idea was to, really bring the best of academia into this world of practice, this laboratory that the two NGOs opened up of deep relationships in places all over the planet that had drastic things going on, but also big opportunities to bring in academic and very pragmatic thinking and action to solve problems. Over these 20 years, we've worked in about 75 countries now directly, with many Stanford students and postdocs and scholars of different types really leading the way. A lot of younger people, unencumbered by tradition, just going in and figuring out how to make change and how to inspire and support change makers in other places. And then we've developed software to help, make accessible all the stuff that university libraries online nowadays hold, but that's mostly just completely inaccessible to normal members of humanity. And so the software has been used in basically all countries, over 190, and then you're getting down to the little Vaticans and places.
Right, exactly.
And at one level, that's been massive scaling. At another level, relative to the problem, there's still a really long way to go. And we're charging up now for a new phase of trying to scale way beyond where we've been and engage with even bigger kind of scaling partners. We're also facing a lot of headwinds, to be sure, with the political shifts in recent months, but there's still a ton of traction, and kind of unfortunately with every tragedy, there's renewed commitment by many, and often conversion of others. So the momentum is still building very much, and in a way with headwinds against working on climate change, there's even more attention to nature, or wrapping climate into nature's agenda and melding of the agendas, which has made a lot of sense for a long time and is now politically tractable in an unexpected kind of way.
Right. Like if government is not going to do anything, then everybody else rushes in to fill this gap.
Climate security really depends on a lot of investment in forest, in sequestered stocks of carbon in the old growth forests around the world, like in the Amazon, but also very much in restoring coastlines, their wetlands, their coral reefs and mangroves and seagrass beds, and all these incredible living elements of resilience that help protect people when severe storms come up, and also help people and places recover after impacts hit. So yeah, there's a lot of ways in which we can address climate as part of securing the biosphere.
I want to come back to your vision of the future and actually ask you a tactical question about getting going early on. And part of the context is that we talked to a few different faculty members who have chosen different types of innovation, right? And some innovate within Stanford, and some have a startup outside of Stanford. And for those who have a startup outside of Stanford, it could be a nonprofit, it could be a for-profit. I'm hearing words from you like partnerships, decision makers, software, scale, right? And these are words that we at Stanford normally associate with a venture-backed software company. And so when you were very early on, it seemed like you might have had a few options, decision one, either do something within Stanford or outside of Stanford, and decision two, if outside of Stanford, either be a nonprofit or a for-profit venture. And you started at Stanford, you started an initiative that's a nonprofit by definition because it's under the university bubble, and you've remained for 20 years. So maybe you could just speak a little bit to that decision-making process early on.
You're pointing up a question in a way that's always looming in front of us. What will the world look like? And will we be able to see, private sector incentives to invest in nature and then, see all the science and learning that we've helped advance through Stanford and the partnership, which I should say the partnership involves about 150 research partners that are in academic institutions, academies, mainly universities around the world, as well as about 350 implementing partners, and they're mostly in the public sector still. We've worked a bit with companies, but most of the action is still very much in the public arena, and there isn't, you still make money by destroying the environment. That's still the deal around the world. And so it's initially we were within Stanford for a couple of reasons. One is that there was a ton of science to be done to highlight the values of nature and actually quantify those and enable all sorts of things, whether it's in a city to enable decision makers to see where nature really ought to be restored.
As far as the sort of initial decision and the entity choice.
Yeah, it made a ton of sense. We needed the research. And there's been a huge opening of research pathways around nature and human well-being over the past couple of decades. First looking really pragmatically at things like the role of nature in water security, where we've, had at least 100 years or more of experience and development of the field of hydrology and then eco-hydrology and such to build on. But then a lot of other areas didn't have much or anything, just opening up fields like pollination ecology, looking at how much farmers actually depend and how much our own health and well-being depends on wild pollinators, little bees mostly, going around and enabling harvest of the most nutritious crops, the fruits, nuts, and veggies. And it's incredible that a huge fraction, like 75% of those most nutritious crops really depend on animal pollination to some degree. Fields like that kept opening up, or same with nature and health, looking at that's still opening. There's so many incredible discoveries. I'll give one now that came up in Finland recently with some researchers we're friends with, who they made an intervention in part of Finland where there's a lot of forest. Kids are out playing at least every weekend in the forest. But in daycare centers, there's typically, and in like primary schools, there's often mostly gravel on the kind of play areas. So they brought in three elements of nature: a little tiny bit of grass that typically a grad student could kind of roll out at the place very quickly. So half of these sites got this treatment of a little bit of grass, a little planter box in which kids could touch some soil, but very tiny, smaller than a section of table here, maybe plant some veggies or a flower or whatever. And then the grad students hauled in a piece of a log from the forest, from a tree that had been cut down. And they measured the kids' immune function using skin tests, saliva tests, blood tests prior to the intervention. And then 5 or 6 weeks later, they measured again. And the kids in these schools and daycare centers that got these tiny bits of nature had a major boost in immune function.
Wow.
So that's just one example of tons of new discoveries that are being made about how deeply we depend on nature or interdepend, with nature. So that's why we needed to be at a university. And there's still a ton more opening up in terms of these frontiers. But then whether to be off campus or on campus has been a question for a long time, and we've wanted to launch an off-campus scaling entity for a while, but we've hired some very good consulting firms to help us explore the possibilities and identify the entrepreneurial realm in which we'd work and all that. And we've got products and services that we are ready to go with, but it's still not lucrative at all. There's just a lot of, I'd say, lack of economic support for this kind of approach. We're still hoping to change that more, and we're possibly going to launch an off-campus entity actually in the coming year. It is going to be a scaling entity wherever it sits, so we're very excited about that. And we have launched a number of startups, about 8, and they're thriving. So they're things that are being launched, but that address, a small part of the domain in which we're trying to drive major shifts. So I know we'll remain on campus, at least for the foreseeable future, in part. Tune in 2026, and we'll see whether we launch something off campus as well.
If I can summarize 2 key factors, one is this idea of scientific research and just the amount of research and development that needed to be done that fit a university environment, because there was so much science to be done, papers to be written, things to be asked and answered and discovered. The other element that maybe you mentioned, but is implicit in all of this, is that Stanford is a very powerful brand, right? And you mentioned this MOU that John Hennessy signed with big NGOs to help get Nat Cap kicked off. And it's likely that you wouldn't have had access to these NGOs or the governments that you were partnering with from the early days. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. The Stanford brand is shockingly and sometimes embarrassingly powerful,
Sure.
Because we'll show up in all sorts of places, and there'll be many of our academic partners with us from other wonderful schools. But the welcoming committee will have a huge Stanford banner and nothing recognizing the other school. So
Got it.
We've definitely had a lot of doors fly open coming from Stanford. Looking ahead, we also are opening a new pathway that really explore the social science domains involved in transforming systems at a massive scale, as has never really been done before. I'm very excited about, will involve this new nascent effort called Sustainable Societies as part of the Door School. Engages a lot of the new research faculty hired in the past couple of years in the social sciences here, as well as from across campus from existing units. There's going to be a lot more going on within academia, but if Nat Cap doesn't scale off campus, I think that's a sign of disaster. So we are really keen to get out into the private sector. We've worked mostly with governments and public sector players. The funders of implementing what we do together with governments are mostly the multilateral development banks like the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and many others. They've all committed to this several years ago. They agreed to mainstream nature throughout their operations, thanks to working together with us for many years. But ultimately, we need to be able to scale through the private sector. We have worked with, probably 30 major corporations in a deep way over sustained, 2 to 3 year or more effort, and very successfully. In, I think, all cases, the corporation has taken up natural capital approaches. Dow Chemical was one of the early ones. And adopted natural capital accounting throughout their operations and made some major decisions and investments based on our work together, but it was very hard to scale across a sector. And similarly, we worked with Unilever under Paul Pullman. They were very ambitious, gave us many projects to advance together on all kinds of things, packaging and product design, procurement, supply chain, risk, and things like that. Developed some really new approaches that they took up. But again, it was really hard to scale across a sector, whereas in the public sector, that scaling is a lot easier to propel. Now we're focused more on the financial sector. There are more and more actors that want to see change, and there are a lot of public-private kind of boundary organizations that have come up that have a mission of driving that change with whom we're partnered. So that's a promising frontier. And then we're hoping also in certain this really heavy impact, but big deal sectors like critical minerals. We're starting to convene major actors in mining, for example, that are really motivated to evolve their practices so they don't destroy the planet in mining operations, really help drive innovation. And there's certainly commitment among many of the key countries that have the world's critical minerals to sustain their landscapes and their waters. So we see a lot of traction opening up there, and maybe a pathway to developing new ways of, here's where Stanford comes in too. The people love coming here, from companies to a place with this amazing credibility and legitimacy and feeling of transparency.
And Stanford is seen as being pro-business, right? I mean, do you think that's been helpful to this?
Yeah, absolutely. Silicon
right.
Valley,
Right.
Critical minerals are used here.
Right, true.
more than anywhere else. It's a great place, and many groups here have advanced dialogues with all kinds of partners. So we're building on, and have participated for a long time in the evolution of this Stanford role. Mm-hmm. And it's a great role to have here. Everybody wins. All the different players on campus enjoy seeing and learning much more about what's going on in different parts of the planet and business sectors. And then, we learn a lot.
Let's say that Nat Cap succeeds beyond your wildest dreams. You move off campus, you scale, you get funding, you figure out a business model, and all of a sudden you have 100, 500, 1,000 scientists and implementers, working with you, or wherever you are at 5Xs or 10Xs, right? I want to get back to this question of what the vision is.
Yeah.
And how we think about what a thriving human civilization looks like in 2080, not just 2030 or 2100, right? I mean, your great-grandchildren, let's say, or your children's great-grandchildren. How do you think about that question? Do you spend time thinking about that, or is there just so much to be done right now to plan for the next 5 years that it's sort of hard to take a step back sometimes?
Yeah, both are true. Right. I think we started thinking about the long-term vision, and then we got really into the nitty-gritty of delivering on maybe our first path, a very technical path of bringing science and the technology through the software, through satellite imagery and other sensing systems, a new way of engaging with partners into what we do. But that track has taken us a long way, and it remains a key track, but we definitely need to bring in this second track, to put it in very simplistic terms, that everyone involved has long recognized that there needs to be a much deeper and more cultural shift in we need to reach people through the heart as well as through the mind. We need to help reactivate nature as a part of people's lives in a way that is just felt very deeply and that influences at a subconscious level how people feel, how we think, how we make decisions and behave. And a lot of this came to life for me and our team about a week ago when we were in Bhutan, actually, a Buddhist country that has retained traditions from many, many centuries and more ago, and that still lives very much in the world of these values and levels of awareness of human interbeing with nature. Mm-hmm. Yet what we saw in Bhutan was very much a vision looking out to 2080, to 2100 and beyond. Prime Minister Modi from India came to a major event there, a global peace prayer that at one level was about peace among people, but you could feel at many, many levels it was about peace among people and nature. Mm-hmm. People from many backgrounds came. Initially, it's the first global peace prayer that they've convened. The ambition now is to bring in, they thought it might be mainly Buddhist coming, and it was, but there were so many others that heard about this and made the long journey in many cases to Bhutan just to experience and be part of a conversation about this deeper transformation that we have to help communities and societies open up. And there are many people in every society that are thinking about and trying to propel this type of movement. And I think within the Natural Capital Project, there's a lot we can learn from both academic realms, in the social sciences especially, and maybe some in business as well, just in areas of things like marketing and just scaling. There are a lot of things we can bring together in a new way. Nobody's really figured out how to drive the revolution that we need away from the industrial civilization that gave birth to Silicon Valley and to Stanford and to so much of the art of running an economy and running societies that is now kind of in our DNA. Yeah. We need to move into a new phase that in some places is called an ecological civilization, to bring in many domains of humanity and lived experience.
And I don't want to be reductive, but it seems like a big driver of all of this is just simply the way that we measure progress. And so, if I'm not mistaken, in Bhutan, they have a gross national happiness metric of some kind. I've also, of course, we all are familiar with GDP as a measure of progress, but I know in your work, in your realm, GEP is an interesting metric. So maybe you can speak to that a little bit.
It's really neat seeing change in how leaders think about measuring progress and measuring their own impact and setting a vision. So we've operated by GDP for a long time, but from our own leaders, we've had those brilliant quotes and a lot of effort to change and green GDP or to bring in other missing aspects of well-being. And in so many ways, GDP misses the mark when it comes to what we really value in life.
Right.
And when we look back on our lives, it's not GDP that looms large. It's all these other things that are not captured. And how can we start bringing those in a meaningful way and move beyond kind of a fixation that seems to operate in many places and consuming material consumption and some of the other addictive types of habits that we have that really seem to be detracting from well-being, both of people and from the biosphere.
Yeah.
So, in recent years, there have been many efforts to green GDP, and those have been blocked for all sorts of political and other reasons. So China, about a decade ago, said, okay, why don't we just come up with something to measure alongside, not in place of GDP, and it's called GEP. gross ecosystem product. It's basically like GDP in that, in terms of how it's measured, it's all the goods and services from nature, the quantity produced multiplied by some meaningful measure of value. A lot of people just get it right away. They say,
of course, yeah.
Well, yeah, if we've got GDP measuring, came up after the Great Depression, when we recognized that we had no data on how local economies were doing, much less, the whole U.S. economy or other, at a macroeconomic level. So similarly, we're just blind in terms of our decision-making systems to, the flow of benefits from nature to people. And that's what GEP measures, but that is mostly hidden from our day-to-day lives.
Right.
And so just waking people up and reporting on GEP, how a city is doing. Like Shenzhen, for example, in China, they invested very heavily in mangrove restoration. These amazing trees that live along coastlines are good at living in salt water, and that really help protect coastlines from hurricanes or cyclones. And they did that rather than building a seawall. It was cheaper to invest in the mangroves, and they expected many other benefits to come from the mangroves, which involve things like fisheries. All the little baby fish live in among the mangrove roots, all the way to onshore. There are these big parks in Shenzhen that have mangroves, and people go cycling and walking, and kids play in them, and you can drink tea. There are a lot of little cafes. It's just
sweet, yeah.
Kind of in a huge metropolis that we think of as a tech center, globally. They're investing heavily in GEP, and they monitor all this. And they had a huge cyclone hit a couple weeks ago. The mangroves really protected the city.
Wow.
And it was a big kind of affirmation of the value of this approach. So we're seeing that kind of investment happening in a local scale. GEP is also used to guide investment farther away. So most cities, like here at Stanford, we get, I think, most of our water from Hetch Hetchy all the way up in Yosemite.
Right.
A wonderful thing for us, the national park providing pure and reliable water. What's happening within countries that are adopting GEP is they're illuminating, where the water comes from and investing in those places. So the receiving communities or big cities invest in these upstream areas and people, and support those people and communities if it's not a national park, which most headwaters are not. So New York has done a similar thing, where the downstream people in the city, over 10 million people, rely on upstream communities about 125 miles north of New York City to shift their practices and provide the safest, cleanest water. And that's been a win-win strategy going on for over 20 years. So
it's hard to quantify even the benefit of clean water.
Yeah.
We'll come up with a number for GEP that will have a dollar sign in front of it, but at the end of the day, if you don't have clean drinking water, what else can you do? Or like these children who aren't having the benefits of nature with their immune system, well, how do you value, being immunocompromised, right? Or is it $1,000, $100,000, $1 million, right? So I love this concept of GEP, and I think it's worth noting that whatever that figure is, it will likely wildly underestimate whatever that value is.
It's a massive lower, underestimate, a very lower bound value. But even a lower bound value, if you can recognize and keep reminding people in really beautiful ways that there's just so much more.
Right.
That lower bound value can really change the equations, the economic equations, and finally recognize ecosystem stewards who mostly are farmers and ranchers and foresters and some fishers, the valuable role they play in driving sustainable production practices. Yeah. So this is happening all over. And then A third, there are lots of uses of GEP, offering ecosystem stewards or others with kind of green, clean business ideas, cheaper loans or investments, if they're GEP positive. So there's a lot of use of GEP now to track progress and track like performance of bonds, green bonds, nature positive bonds. There are all these GEP linked financial instruments that are starting to be used. It's a simple metric that greatly underestimates the value of nature, that reminds us of the value of universities in helping to make it ever more inclusive. So we're building into GEP a mental health model for the first time.
Wow.
We have a physical health model in there for nature and physical activity. Having a park greatly elevates how much people exercise in a place and improves health in a very measurable, quantifiable way all around the world.
I believe that.
So we're getting all these numbers more and more in there, and it's just part of the long-term change that we want to see, where this would all be absolutely mainstream.
Right.
And it would be absolute lunacy not to include nature kind of in everything.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. There's so much more that I want to ask you, but I think only have time for one more question. And it's my obligatory ending question, which is, if Stanford could make an institutional change that would help you in your work or would support others like you in being entrepreneurial faculty members, getting their projects off the ground, be it a med school person or a computer science person or another Door School faculty member, what might that institutional change be?
Wow, I can give you a very heartfelt and pointed answer. It might sound small, but it's tens of millions or maybe even hundreds of millions of dollars are sitting on the table. I'll just say Nat Cap faces incredible demand, and there are a lot of institutions that want to invest in the research and the support through capacity and training, education, and also through the software development that we conduct here at Stanford. But we can't get the money into Stanford. And it's because of all these hitches in contracting. So you end up in running things like this, coming up against all kinds of institutional barriers that were probably laid out with the best of intentions over 100 years ago.
Right.
And
by Jane Stanford.
Right. And so it's basically at one level, a very good friend of mine who's served on the board of trustees for decades and knows the system inside out, says it's like a rusty old car at this point, and it's hard to, get the momentum going to polish up at least parts of the car. And I'm really hoping to polish up this part, because the at least tens of millions and maybe much more of support that could come into the university would be transformative here, opening up, just huge research and training opportunities for young scholars and others, faculty. But it's extremely frustrating now, I think, to all parties, that the kinds of contracts that are being offered by mostly the multilateral development banks, the United Nations and different units, the United Nations Development Program, Environment Program, the Global Environment Facility, they are powered up and wanting to help drive scaling through Stanford, and we haven't been able to embrace this flow. So that's my main wish and desperate hope.
Well,
but
I hope it's heard.
Maybe the next would be to help us scale into the private sector, where there has been such a remarkable track record of pioneering new enterprises, and we're really game to try that ourselves, though the world hasn't yet pioneered anything in this space. So it's a riskier leap to take, but I'm hoping we can do both.
Do both. 2026 and beyond will
That's
be
right.
big.
Thank you for featuring this conversation, and thank you for giving me the chance as well to mention again how much gratitude we have for the home we've made really good use of for 20 years, and looking forward to working with a lot of new people as well as all the old friends.
Absolutely.
In the phase ahead.